Hello class, so now I'm offering a screencast in reference to the work we've done on Heraclitus, except that this time I'm focusing on students' work in the class. So I'll be looking at two examples here, two really good examples of the assignment. So let's read this first one. So Heraclitus said, "We step into and we do not step into the same rivers. We are and we are not." Unquote. This fragment is an example of metaphysics as it relates to identity. We do not step into the same river because the water is always flowing, but the flow of the water is what makes the river a river. If the river had still water, it could be a lake or a pond, but not a river. Heraclitus believed that all things are always changing and that he uses a river to illustrate this idea often. He asserted that life is a constant state of flux, arising as one thing and, as time goes on, becoming something else. Humans, for example, are born with little understanding of the world around them and a minimal sense of identity. But as we grow and learn, we change who we are. We are as toddlers. Who we are as toddlers is different than who we are as adolescents, and who we are when we are elderly is different than who we are when we were as teenagers. This ties back into the river fragment because just as the river is still a river, regardless of its changing waters, we are still the same person at our core, even as our own sense of identities change. Okay, so this should bring a lot of students to recognize their own work too, because a lot of students tied the question of identity into personal identity. Okay, so one thing we're also recognizing is that identity is also of things and ideas as well, right? So identity is not just having to do with our identity, but also things, ideas, concepts, so on and so forth, right? And so one thing I would point out with this student is, for example, changing the verb choice here. And then also, too, in terms of identity, we're noticing that the student is writing about identity here in 3 references. I would like, though, to maybe see the structure of it just a little bit more in terms of how the student is explaining that identity and how that is structured, right? That, in other words, in order to be identified, if a river still had water, it could be a lake or a pond, but not a river. That's part of its identification, something like that. So be just slightly more explicit with the structure of the thinking. That's important. So whenever we're thinking of the structure of the thinking, we're keying into how we understand reason and logic, by the way. Okay. Still, this is an excellent example. I like it because it's clear. The student is getting the word count nicely, and it is also the student's not getting too distracted with the example. There is a sense of structure. It's a little more implied than explicit, but still excellent work. So let's move to our second example right here. Let's get it so we can see it clearly. Okay, so to soul it is death to become water, to water death to become earth, but from earth water is born, and from water soul. I would have maybe added punctuation there, and then maybe dash dash Heraclitus, something like that. But let's read this. So Heraclitus's philosophical ideas about the world were based around the unity of opposites. To him, opposites were not opposite at all, at least the way we as people believe opposition to be, but in fact just different forms of change. we as people believe opposites to mean two things that are completely different with little or no similarities, but that is not the case for Heraclitus. In the quote above, maybe comma, Heraclitus describes a cycle of life. Soul dies, it becomes water. Water dies, it becomes earth. Although death is believed to be the end of that thing, it is really just a start of change. Therefore, that could be one word. According to Heraclitus, there is no end, just change, or at the essence of all things is change. With this idea of there being no end but only change, the unity of opposites is found. Something can be young and old. You can be yourself but still not yourself. That's because all those opposites are unified by the idea of change. Maybe that doesn't need to be capitalized. Through change, the idea of opposites, the way we understand it, becomes meaningless because everything is connected through change. Now, I would challenge this meaningless point here in the sense that it's not meaningless. It becomes a way in which we're looking at something beyond opposites, but the opposites still, there is such a thing as polarity still, right? We still do have opposites, but so it's not rendered meaningless. It is something to be brought into question, perhaps, right? Then time changes all things, and all things change except for change. Therefore, so again, therefore, all things are connected or unified in the mind of Heraclitus. Now, let's look at some of the grammar problems. So again, we could have therefore edited a couple of times there. And then content-wise, we could edit this meaningless here because it's not completely meaningless, right? Opposition is something that is important in the way that we think of things, except that perhaps we don't examine how we understand that better, right? Then also the student, though, is what I'm appreciating about how the student is writing about the fragment is that the student is really keen to show the structure of how this is understood, right? That in other words, laying out what opposites mean and then showing how this actually is something that has to do with opposites that are then unified, right? That in other words, you can be yourself but not yourself. That's because all those opposites are unified by the idea of change. So even change becomes an identifier in the sense that opposition actually constitutes ways that we identify things. So what's good that the student's doing is they're showing how it is that the idea is structured. So that's like the most impressive part of this writing is that it's showing me a structure of how the fragment is understood, and then also including all the points of the assignment. It's not over the word count. It's clear that the student's writing about the union of opposites for Heraclitus. Heraclitus is spelled correctly, etc. Okay, so there's some minor issues, but for the most part, this is excellent. Okay, so great job with the fragments for those students, and then also a lot of the other students too, in the sense that the work is something that's always really pleasant to read because I could tell that students get engaged with Heraclitus to the degree that they're embracing the ideas themselves. So as a whole, this is always a fun assignment to read everyone's work in connection to Heraclitus. Okay, so he's remarkably accessible, I guess is another way of putting it. So thank you, and have a good one. Talk more later.